The telegram reached British military installations throughout England in November 1945, bearing the War Office seal and stamped Most Secret. Female German prisoners of war were to be subjected only to standard detention procedures. No preferential accommodation, no extra provisions, no unnecessary interaction beyond what security demanded. They had served the Reich, the directive reminded camp commanders, and the Reich had unleashed unspeakable terror upon Britain's shores. They were not victims deserving sympathy, they were enemies owed justice. Yet when Major Richard Blackwood read the directive at Camp Lodgemore near Sheffield, he did something the War Office never foresaw. He folded the telegram neatly, placed it in his filing cabinet beneath a pile of requisition paperwork, and deliberately set it aside. He was not alone. Across dozens of camps holding German women signals operators, clerks, nurses, and Luftwaffe auxiliaries captured during the collapse of the Third Reich, British soldiers read their orders, looked at the exhausted women before them in worn, threadbare uniforms, and made a decision that would define them. They chose humanity over bitterness. What followed would challenge long-held assumptions in both nations about justice, revenge, and what it truly means to win not only a war, but the peace that follows. But before we explore this remarkable chapter of history, if you value untold stories that expose the complexity of human behavior in wartime, please like and subscribe. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across Britain for the first time in years. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus, celebrating the end of 6 years of bombing, rationing, and sacrifice. Yet for thousands of German women who had served in auxiliary roles within the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, the war's conclusion marked the beginning of an uncertain ordeal. They were rounded up amid the chaos of Germany's collapse, women who had plotted aircraft movements, staffed field hospitals, operated telephone exchanges, and managed supply depots. Most were young, scarcely past their early 20s. They had joined the war effort because it was expected, because refusal invited suspicion and persecution, because their fathers and brothers had already been conscripted and someone had to keep the machinery of war running. None had imagined becoming prisoners of war. Britain's stance toward female POWs was complicated. Under the Geneva Convention, anyone who had served in a military capacity could be detained as a prisoner of war, yet Britain had never anticipated holding thousands of German women. The nation was exhausted, financially strained, and still recovering from years of bombing that had killed more than 60,000 civilians. London, Coventry, Plymouth, and Liverpool carried the scars of the Blitz. Every family had lost someone. The question became unavoidable. What should be done with the women who had served the regime that had sought to destroy you? Throughout the summer and autumn of 1945, the women were transported from holding camps in Belgium and northern Germany to England. They crossed the Channel aboard military vessels, many sick with seasickness and gripped by fear. Rumors swept through the detention camps. Some claimed the British would execute collaborators, others insisted they would be sent east to labor camps in the Soviet zone to rebuild the ruins of Germany. None of them knew what awaited them. As the ships neared the English coastline, the women crowded the railings despite guards ordering them below deck. What they saw silenced them. The white cliffs of Dover rose from the sea, unbombed and timeless. Port facilities stood intact. Fishing villages dotted the coast, houses upright, gardens tended, laundry hanging on lines, chimneys smoking. Britain had been bombed. They knew this, some had even helped plan those raids, but it had not been annihilated as Germany had. A young woman named Ilse, who had served as a Luftwaffe radio operator, stood at the rail and wept. She had last seen Hamburg consumed by firestorms, her childhood city reduced to ash by RAF bombing. She had watched Berlin collapse beneath Soviet artillery. Every major German city bore wounds that would take decades to heal. England, though scarred, still stood. "We lost," she whispered to another woman beside her. "We lost everything." The buses that carried them inland were fitted with wire mesh over the windows, yet the women could still glimpse the English countryside rolling past, green fields scattered with sheep, intact villages with stone churches and tidy cottages, farm workers gathering the autumn harvest, children playing in schoolyards. It was normal, devastatingly, impossibly normal. The contrast with Germany, where cities were graveyards and children scavenged through rubble while starvation loomed, was almost incomprehensible. Britain had fought a total war and survived. Germany had fought a total war and been obliterated. For many of the women, this was the moment they truly understood what defeat meant. Camp Lodgemore lay on the moorland outside Sheffield, originally constructed to house Italian prisoners earlier in the war. The site had been hastily adapted when notice arrived that female German prisoners would be transferred there. Guard towers encircled the perimeter, barbed wire enclosed rows of Nissen huts, and a sharp November wind swept across the exposed ground. When the buses arrived with the first group of women, Major Richard Blackwood stood outside the administration building and watched them disembark. He was 42, a career officer who had served in India before the war and spent the conflict in logistics and administration, never in combat, always organizing those who were. He had expected this posting to be routine, process prisoners, maintain discipline, await repatriation orders. But as the women stepped stiffly from the buses, his assumptions crumbled. They looked shattered, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, inadequate clothing offering little defense against the Yorkshire cold. Some limped. One woman, visibly pregnant, moved slowly, every step careful and painful. Several were barely older than his own daughter, who had spent the war driving ambulances in London. These were meant to be the enemy. They looked like refugees. Blackwood had the War Office directive in his office and had read it repeatedly, troubled more each time. The language was unmistakable: minimal shelter, standard rations, rigid discipline. The implication was unmistakable: make them suffer, make them feel defeated, make them pay. But standing there, watching the women tremble in the cold wind, Blackwood made a choice that would shape the remainder of his life. He would adhere to the Geneva Convention in full, and where the War Office directive conflicted with basic human decency, he would choose decency. The first adjustment came at once. The directive mandated outdoor processing regardless of weather, a deliberate hardship designed to set the tone of captivity. Blackwood ordered the women moved into a heated processing hall instead. His adjutant, Captain Geoffrey Mills, raised an eyebrow. "Sir, the directive states that we process them efficiently," Blackwood cut in. "I cannot process prisoners who collapse from hypothermia. The heated hall is more efficient." Mills, who had lost his brother in a bombing raid on Bristol, understood what Blackwood was truly doing. He also understood that he agreed. "Yes, sir, more efficient." Inside the processing hall, the women were met by Sergeant Mary Patterson of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. Patterson, a Glaswegian, was a no-nonsense veteran who had driven supply lorries through the Blitz and had little tolerance for self-pity. But she also had eyes. One glance at the pregnant woman and she immediately summoned the camp medical officer. You, and you," she said, pointing to 3 women who appeared ill. "Medical tent. Now, the rest of you will be examined in turn. Anyone feeling faint or unwell, speak up immediately." This was not in the protocol. The protocol required documentation first and medical screening afterward. But Patterson had been a nurse before the war. She recognized triage when she saw it. The medical officer, Captain David Thornton, arrived within minutes. He had served with field hospitals in France and had seen the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. What he saw in the German PSWs was disturbingly familiar: malnutrition, untreated infections, the physical toll of prolonged stress and inadequate food. The pregnant woman was in early labor, likely triggered by the journey's stress. Thornton didn't hesitate. "She needs a proper hospital. We can't deliver a baby in a camp medical tent." Blackwood authorized transport to Sheffield Royal Infirmary immediately, despite knowing it would require explanation to his superiors. A German P. receiving care in a civilian hospital would raise questions. He decided he would answer them when the time came. The other women watched this unfold with growing confusion. They had expected harshness, perhaps cruelty. The British had every reason to hate them. London had burned. Coventry had been nearly destroyed. British families had spent 6 years in terror. Yet here was a British officer authorizing hospital care for a German prisoner. Here was a Scottish sergeant barking orders to ensure the sick received immediate attention. Here were British soldiers who looked at them with something that wasn't quite kindness, but wasn't hatred either. Something more like weary professionalism mixed with a reluctant recognition of shared humanity. It didn't match what they had been told about the British. It didn't match what they expected from their enemies. The next point of departure from the War Office directive came at the dowsing station. Army regulations required all new prisoners to be doused and issued camp uniforms. The process was meant to be impersonal and efficient. Strip, shower, disinfectant powder, prison garb, but Sergeant Patterson had made her own modifications. She had requisitioned proper soap, not the harsh carbolic soap issued for general use, but the same soap provided to British service women. She had ensured the water heaters were functioning properly so the showers would actually be hot, and she had posted female ATS personnel as attendants rather than male guards, providing a level of privacy the directive never mentioned. "These are prisoners, not livestock," she told her staff firmly. "You will maintain discipline and security, but you will also maintain basic human dignity. Anyone who can't manage both can request reassignment." Clear? It was clear when Elsa stepped into the shower and felt hot water cascade over her skin for the first time in months. She broke down, sobbing. She had been cold for so long, dirty for so long, frightened for so long. The warmth was almost painful in its intensity. One of the ATS attendants, a young woman named Dorothy, who had lost her fiancé at Arnhem, heard the crying and looked away. She had wanted to hate these German women. She had told herself they deserved whatever discomfort they experienced. But hearing someone cry with relief at something as basic as hot water made hatred difficult to sustain. After the showers, the women were issued clothing. The directive specified standard P uniforms, drab, shapeless, deliberately demoralizing, but Patterson had quietly arranged for them to receive modified ATS uniforms that were being phased out. They were military issue, yes, but they were designed for women. They fit. They had been cleaned and pressed. It was a small thing, but for women who had felt stripped of their humanity, being given clothing that acknowledged their dignity mattered enormously. The mesh hall was where the disconnect between orders and reality became impossible to ignore. The War Office directive specified rations adequate for survival, 1 to 800 calories per day, sufficient to maintain health, but deliberately less generous than what German PS had received earlier in the war when Britain was more prosperous. But when the women entered the mess hall that first evening, they found something different. The camp cook, Sergeant Arthur Webb, was a Londoner whose family home had been destroyed in the Blitz. He had every reason to be bitter. Instead, he had decided that his kitchen would be one place where hatred didn't dictate policy. "I cook food," he had told Major Blackwood bluntly when asked about his plans. "I don't cook revenge. You want them fed properly, I'll feed them properly. You want them starved, you'll another cook." Blackwood had not argued. The meal was simple by British standards: shepherd's pie, carrots, bread, and tea. But for women who had lived on cabbage soup and Ozat's coffee for months, it was a feast. Real meat, real vegetables, fresh bread that actually tasted like bread, not sawdust. Some couldn't eat much. Their stomachs had shrunk too severely. Others ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid the food would be snatched away. Several began to cry silently. The British soldiers serving the food didn't know how to react. Private Thomas Evans, a Welsh farm worker who had been drafted in 1942, watched a woman about his sister's age try to eat while tears ran down her face. Without thinking, he placed an extra piece of bread on her tray. She looked up at him, startled. "Danker," she whispered. Evans nodded awkwardly and moved on, feeling confused by his own gesture. She was German. The Germans had bombed Wales, had killed British soldiers, had started this entire bloody war. He should hate her, but he didn't. He just felt sorry for her. That night, the women were shown to their quarters. The directive had specified minimal accommodation, basic shelter, sufficient bedding to prevent illness, nothing more. But Blackwood had ordered the Nissen huts thoroughly cleaned, heaters installed and tested, and adequate blankets provided. The Geneva Convention requires we house prisoners in conditions comparable to our own troops, he told Captain Mills when questioned. Our troops would not be expected to sleep in unheated quarters in November. Neither will the prisoners. It was technically true if interpreted generously. Elsa found herself assigned to a Nissen hut that, while Spartan, was clean, weatherproof, and blessedly warm. She had a proper bed with a mattress, pillow, and 3 blankets. There was a stove in the center of the hut, keeping the entire space heated. She sat on her bed and tried to process the day's events. They had been fed real food, given hot showers, provided warm clothing, and heated shelter. One of their number had been sent to a civilian hospital for proper medical care. "Why are they being kind to us?" whispered a woman named Greta from the next bed. "After everything Germany did to them, why?" No one had an answer. In Germany, prisoners were treated brutally as a matter of course. The concentration camps, rumors of which were becoming undeniable facts, had operated on industrialized cruelty. Soviet PS had been deliberately starved. Even Western Allied prisoners had often been treated harshly. But here, in the camp of their enemies, they were being treated with a basic humanity that contradicted everything they understood about war and defeat. That confusion, that cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality, was only beginning. Word of the pregnant woman spread quickly through both prisoner and guard populations. She had been taken to Sheffield Royal Infirmary where British doctors delivered a healthy baby boy in a proper maternity ward. The woman had been given private recovery accommodations, postnatal care, and infant supplies. When the other prisoners learned this, the implications began to sink in. The British weren't just following minimum requirements, they were actively choosing compassion. Captain Mills found Major Blackwood in his office 3 days after the women's arrival. "Sir, I feel I should inform you that the men are fraternizing." Blackwood looked up from his paperwork. "Define fraternizing, Captain." "Conversations beyond what's necessary for camp operations." Private Evans taught one of the prisoners English words yesterday while supervising a work detail. Corporal Henderson played chess with another during recreational hours. "The lads are being friendly. Are security protocols being maintained?" "Yes, sir." "Is discipline intact?" "Yes, sir." "Then I don't see a problem, Captain." Mills hesitated. "Sir, the directive specifically prohibits unnecessary interaction." Blackwood set down his pen and looked at his adjutant. "Seriously, Captain Mills, I'm going to share something with you in confidence. That directive was written by people in London who've never run a camp. They're angry, understandably so, after what we've endured. But anger is a poor foundation for policy. These women will be here for months, possibly longer. We can either run a camp based on hatred, which will breed resentment and make everyone miserable, or we can run a camp based on order and basic human decency, which will be more efficient and more humane. I've chosen the latter. If you disagree, submit a formal objection, and I'll forward it up the chain of command." Mills was silent for a long moment. Then, "No objection, sir. I just wanted you to be aware." "I am aware, Captain, and I'm accepting the consequences of my choices." What Blackwood didn't say was that he'd already begun preparing for those consequences. He kept meticulous records showing that every decision could be justified within the Geneva Convention. He documented everything, knowing that eventually someone in London would notice that Camp Lodge operated differently from other facilities. When that day came, he would need proof that he'd acted properly, if not precisely according to the directive. Within weeks, a routine had established itself at Camp Lodge Moor. The prisoners woke at 6:30, assembled for roll call at 7, and attended breakfast at 7:30. Work assignments began at 9 o'clock, mostly light duties like laundry, administrative tasks, and camp maintenance. Lunch at noon, more work until 4, dinner at 5:30, free time until 9, lights out at 10. It was structured but not harsh. The work kept them occupied without being punitive, and within that structure, small moments of humanity accumulated. Private Evans continued teaching Elsa English during garden work details. At first, it was purely practical. She needed to understand instructions, but gradually it became something more. She taught him German in return. They discussed their lives before the war, finding unexpected common ground. Both came from farming families. Both had wanted to be teachers before the war interrupted their education. After all this, Evans said one afternoon, "What will you do?" Ilse considered this. "Go home if there is still a home. Try to help rebuild. Try to understand how we let this happen." Let what happen? All of it. The war, the camps, everything. Evans had heard about the concentration camps at Liberation. The photographs from Belsen had been published in British newspapers, impossible to deny or dismiss. He wanted to ask if she'd known, but he couldn't find the words. Elsa answered the unasked question. "We knew something terrible was happening. We told ourselves we didn't know details, but that was cowardice. We knew enough. We just didn't want to know more." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Evans about the war. He respected her for it. Sergeant Patterson had initiated educational sessions for the prisoners, English classes, basic literacy for those who needed it, even some vocational training. It wasn't in the directive, but she argued it was necessary for eventual reintegration. Major Blackwood approved it without hesitation. "These women will return to Germany eventually. The better prepared they are, the more effective they'll be in rebuilding their country. That serves everyone's interests." He was right. Though his real motivation was simpler, it was the decent thing to do. The classes became popular among the prisoners. Many were hungry for intellectual stimulation after months of displacement and uncertainty. They studied English voraciously, practiced writing, and engaged in discussions about literature and history. One of the volunteer teachers, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Pemberton, who had lost his son at Dunkirk, was initially skeptical about teaching German women, but he found them to be attentive, curious students. They asked difficult questions about British democracy, about freedom of speech, about how a society could function without authoritarian control. In Germany, we were told that democracy was weak, one woman said during a discussion, that only strong leadership could make a nation great, but Britain is a democracy and you won the war. How do we understand this? Pétain chose his words carefully. Strength isn't found in silencing dissent, it's found in allowing it. A democracy is strong because it can adapt, because it allows criticism and correction. Tyranny is brittle, it looks strong until it shatters. The women sat with this concept, turning it over in their minds. For some, it was the beginning of a profound transformation in understanding. In December 1945, Major Blackwood implemented another modification to the directive. The War Office had specified 1 letter per month, heavily censored, family, but Blackwood authorized 2 letters monthly with lighter censorship. Only military intelligence would be redacted, not personal content. He also worked with the Red Cross to help trace missing family members, going far beyond what was required. When the women learned they could write home, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Elsa sat with paper and pencil, struggling to find words. How could she explain where she was, what she had experienced, what it meant that their enemies were treating them with kindness? Lymut, she began, I am alive and well. I am in England in a place called Yorkshire. The British feed us properly and house us warmly. I know this will sound impossible, but they are treating us better than we were treated in the final months of the war. The guards are not cruel, they are just men doing their duty, and they do it with fairness. She paused, wondering if her mother would think she'd been brainwashed. The truth was so different from what propaganda had taught them about the British. Please write back if you can. I need to know you are alive and safe. I think of you every day. 3 weeks later, she received a reply. Horror. Mother was alive, living in the ruins of Dusseldorf with 2 other families, cold and hungry, but surviving. The letter was brief, written on torn paper in shaky handwriting that spoke of hardship, but it was proof of life. That was everything. Not all the women were fortunate. Some letters returned marked addressee unknown. Others never received replies, leaving them to fear the worst. But the ability to try to maintain some connection with home made an enormous psychological difference. As winter deepened, the relationship between prisoners and guards continued to evolve in ways the War Office had not anticipated and would not have approved. Corporal Jack Henderson, who had spent 2 years as a Japanese P in Burma and knew firsthand what it meant to be treated inhumanely, found himself playing chess regularly with a former German player named Liesel. She was brilliant at the game, beating him consistently. You know, he told her after one match, in Burma, the guards would have beaten me for winning at anything. Competition implied equality, and prisoners weren't equal to guards. Liesel nodded slowly. I heard stories about how we treated prisoners in the East, Russian prisoners. I pretended I didn't hear. But I did. I am ashamed. That's more than most would admit, Henderson said quietly. Sergeant Patterson developed a mentoring relationship with several of the younger women. She taught them about nursing, administration, and practical skills they could use after repatriation. When one woman confessed she was terrified to return to Germany, Patterson listened without judgment. War changes everything, Patterson said. You can't go back to who you were before, but you can decide who you become after. That's always your choice. In February 1946, the reckoning came. A War Office inspection team arrived at Camp Lodge Moor without warning. They had received reports, anonymous complaints from someone within the camp system that certain facilities were deviating significantly from approved protocols regarding female PS. The lead inspector was Colonel Reginald Thornberry, a veteran of the First World War, who had spent this war in administrative roles in London. He arrived with a clipboard, a copy of the November directive, and clear instructions to enforce compliance. Major Blackwood met him at the gate, knowing his career was likely ending. The inspection lasted 3 days. Thornberry interviewed guards, reviewed records, inspected facilities, and observed operations. He noted the heated quarters, the generous food portions, the educational programs, the lenient male policies. He watched guards playing chess with prisoners, teaching English, sharing cigarettes, and jokes. Everything he saw contradicted the directive's intent. On the final evening, he summoned Blackwood to a private meeting. Major, you are aware of the War Office directive regarding treatment of female German PS. Yes, sir. And you chose to interpret it creatively. I chose to prioritize the Geneva Convention, sir. Where the directive conflicted with convention requirements, I followed the convention. That's a diplomatic way of saying you ignored your orders. Blackwood stood straight. Sir, I made command decisions based on conditions on the ground. The directive was written for abstract enemies. I was dealing with real human beings. I chose to treat them in accordance with international law and basic human decency. Thornberry was silent for a long moment. Then he removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. Major Blackwood, I came here expecting to find a camp commander who'd gone soft. What I found instead is a well-run facility with excellent morale, no security breaches, and prisoners who are being effectively prepared for repatriation. Blackwood said nothing, uncertain where this was going. The directive was written in anger. Thornberry continued. Understandable anger after 6 years of war. But you were here dealing with reality, not policy papers. And frankly, Major, your approach is probably what we should have mandated in the first place. Sir, I'm not going to recommend charges. My report will state that Camp Lodgemore is in full compliance with the Geneva Convention and that any deviations from the directive were made in service of effective camp management. London can interpret that however they wish. Relief flooded through Blackwood. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. What you did required moral courage, but it also created complications. Other camps will hear about this. There will be questions. You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with the consequences. I can live with them, sir. That evening, Blackwood informed his staff that the camp would continue operating as before. When Sergeant Patterson heard, she smiled grimly. About bloody time someone in London showed sense. Word spread through the prisoner population. They understood what had been at stake, that the kindness they'd received wasn't official policy, but individual choice. That British soldiers had risked their careers to treat German prisoners with dignity. Ilse wrote in her diary that night, "Today I learned that conscience can overcome orders, that ordinary people can choose goodness even when institutions demand cruelty. The British could have made us suffer. They chose mercy instead." I will never forget this. By spring 1946, repatriation plans were underway. The process would take months, but the end of captivity was visible. The women felt conflicting emotions. They desperately wanted to go home, to see families, to begin rebuilding. But they dreaded what awaited them. Germany was devastated. Food was scarce. The occupation was harsh, and they themselves had changed in ways that would make reintegration difficult. I'm afraid, Elsa confessed to Private Evans during one of their last work details together. Not of the conditions, though those are terrible. I'm afraid I won't fit anymore. I've learned too much here. I've changed too much. Evans nodded. That's probably good. Germany needs people who've changed, who've learned different ways of thinking. You'll help rebuild something better. I hope so, but it will be difficult. In their final weeks, the women sought out the British soldiers who had shown them kindness. Elsa found Evans in the garden and gave him a small wooden carving she'd made, a rose, England's symbol. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "You treated me like a human being when you could have treated me like an enemy. I will remember always." Evans took the carving, moved beyond words. "I didn't do anything special." "That is the point," Elsa said. "You did not need to be cruel. Many would have been. You chose differently." Similar scenes played out across the camp. Women thanked the guards who had shared cigarettes, taught them English, or simply smiled when they passed. They expressed gratitude to Sergeant Patterson, whose firm kindness had steadied them through difficult months. They thanked Sergeant Webb, whose meals had literally sustained them. They thanked Major Blackwood, though few fully understood the personal risk he had undertaken. Blackwood accepted their appreciation quietly. "You would have done the same," he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced that was true. The ship transporting them back to Germany departed from Southampton in June 1946. The women stood at the rail, watching England's coast fade from view, each carrying memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Germany in 1946 was almost unimaginable in its devastation. Ilse traveled from the port at Cuxhaven to what remained of Hamburg, moving through a landscape of ruins. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. People lived in cellars and partially destroyed buildings. Children with aged expressions begged for food. The black market thrived while official authorities struggled to maintain order. When she finally found her mother in a makeshift shelter, Their reunion was joyful but layered with complexity. Her mother was alive but aged beyond her years, worn thin by hardship and loss. "You look healthy," her mother said, her tone revealing something between relief and uncertainty. "The British fed us well," Ilse admitted. "They treated us better than they were required to." Her mother said nothing, yet Ilse could sense the confusion, the unanswered questions, the silent struggle to understand what it all meant. Ilse remained in Germany, using her command of English to work as a translator for the British occupation authorities. She married a schoolteacher who shared her commitment to democratic values. She raised children and told them stories of the war, of captivity, and of British soldiers who chose compassion when they could have chosen retaliation. She never forgot Private Evans, Major Blackwood, or the others at Camp Lodge Moor. She kept the wooden carving Evans had given her, along with the rose he had grown in the camp garden, pressed inside a book for the rest of her life. Decades later, when the Berlin Wall fell, Ilse was an elderly woman watching the celebrations, reflecting on Germany's long and painful journey from totalitarian rule to democracy. "It took us 40 years, she told her daughter, to learn what the British tried to teach us in 1946, that people matter more than ideology, that mercy is more powerful than cruelty, and that the true measure of a civilization is how it treats those who have no power." The secret directive concerning German female prisoners of war was never officially rescinded. It remained policy on paper. Yet across Britain, officers like Major Blackwood quietly chose another course. They chose to recognize prisoners as human beings. They chose to treat defeated enemies with respect. They chose conscience over command. This was not a tale of saints and villains. The British soldiers were not flawless heroes. They were ordinary men navigating extraordinary circumstances. The German women were not blameless. They had served a regime responsible for immense crimes. But within the narrow space created by choosing mercy instead of cruelty, change became possible. The women who returned to Germany carried lessons that would influence their nation's rebuilding. They had seen democracy practiced, not preached. They had experienced personal dignity. They had learned that authority could be questioned and that conscience sometimes required quiet defiance. Major Blackwood was never court-martialed. His discreet resistance remained little more than a footnote in military records. He returned to civilian life after the war and spoke rarely of his time at Camp Lodge Moor. But the women he helped never forgot him. When he died in 1974, Ilse traveled from Germany to Yorkshire to attend his funeral, carrying with her dozens of letters from former prisoners who could not make the journey but wished to honor the man who had shown them that even amid war, humanity could survive. The story of Camp Lodge Moor and the secret order British soldiers refused to obey reminds us that individual choices matter. Systems and policies may demand harshness, but people can choose compassion. Orders may insist on cruelty, but conscience can call for mercy. Britain's victory was not only military, it was moral. By choosing to treat defeated enemies with dignity, British soldiers demonstrated the values they claimed to defend. They proved that democracy, human rights, and the rule of law were not mere ideals, but principles guiding action even toward those who had sought their destruction. And it began with ordinary soldiers who looked at orders demanding cruelty and quietly chose decency instead. If this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on the power of individual moral choice even in the face of authority, please like and subscribe. These stories from history are not simply about the past, they are lessons for how we should live today. They remind us that we always have a choice, even when it feels as though we do not. Sometimes, choosing kindness over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, humanity over orders, is the bravest act of all. Thank you for watching, and remember, the world is shaped not by those who obey blindly, but by those who possess the courage to follow their conscience.